bounce. Just a couple of housekeeping to begin with. Could everybody please, except for the panelists, of course, turn off their mics and their cameras. We are recording this session, which will be available after it has concluded. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions which I will ask the panel at the end of the session. So please feel free to type any questions you may have into the chat function, and I will bring whichever ones I can to the attention of the panel at the end. So for now, I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to hand you over to IFA's Director of Communications and Advocacy, Bernard Malee, and he can introduce our panelists and kick off the session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Emer, for that introduction. I'll come to the panelists maybe just after I share some slides, if that's okay. So this really is a take on the reputation of the industry during the time of COVID. And I guess, we've had, a good session of, difficulties in terms of supply and research. I'm sorry, my screen is just frozen. So I'll go back into that again and start from the start. Okay. So we have some stats, first of all, just to bring you through where things are at in terms of our reputation and so the metrics that might attach to our reputation globally. So if you look at what has happened in the last number of months, I mean, COVID has delivered a really big audience for the industry across the world. And so if you look at some of the surveys that have come out in the last number of weeks and months, Caliber, which is a people listening platform, placed the industry's trust and like score at about 68.2%. That's up from 64.9% in 2018. So a little bit of a rise there, as we can see. And they sampled 13,000 consumers, patients and doctors across the world. In the US, then, if you look at Gallup, their research says that the industry's rating has risen 7 points to 34% between August 2019 and August 2020. So again, a positive indicator of the effect that the pandemic has had on the reputation of the industry across the world. And then in the US, again, a recent Harris poll has found that 40% of Americans believe that the industry's reputation has improved. So, these are good indicators for where we're at. And if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, that's a survey that's done every year by a public relations company. They have found an uptick in our reputation score as well. And indeed, our own analysis done by Ipsos and RBI, and in a minute I'll introduce Tarek Laher to you. They have said that over half of people, or 51%, have a positive opinion about the industry here in Ireland. And that's up 7 points since we did the last set of results in September 2018. So again, this is a really encouraging score for us. Our media coverage has spiked, which I'm obviously very happy about. We've more than 300 news articles nationally last year during the course of January to November, which was a figure that Viewpoint Media generated for us, and I'll introduce you later to Doreen Markwell from that company. And we've had twice as many media mentions as news articles generated, so this is really positive again. And the actual sentiment around that news coverage was entirely positive, almost as good as you might get with the chart. FP is a media exposure, that's the equivalent in Brussels of IFA, has increased about threefold. That's across Europe, and on vaccines news coverage about fivefold. There are figures that came through to us there at the end of last year. And as part of our response to the pandemic, we thought about how we could share what it was that companies were doing across their manufacturing sites, across commercial teams, across research, and we put together these user-generated pieces of content, which helped to, I guess, to galvanize the industry community across, their response to the pandemic. And we put a number of these videos out last year, and we recorded over 750,000 views on those, and about 35,000 engagements in the reach. The reach was about 1 million. So that was really good for us to do. And in terms of how it looked on screen, on the left-hand side there, you'll see that we got people just basically to record on their phones or on their tablets how they were responding in their own companies to the pandemic across 3 categories: science, supply, and supports. Many people, of course, were working on manufacturing lines. That didn't change because manufacturing production was an essential business, which the government had designated. with some support from us and some advocacy and influence. But more people actually were working from home, particularly those who were working with the commercial teams, and so therefore we wanted to create a kind of authentic vantage point for those people to be able to give their point of view on their phones, on their tablets. It wasn't particularly high production. It was very much around the daily life of people now as they manage the pandemic in their own lives and in their own working lives, and we brought that to life then through video. So science, supply and support's again a neat way of putting our response into compartments. Science is about searching for vaccines and treatment. Supply is about making medicines and getting them to patients. And support is the work that many of our companies are doing around the country, working with hospitals and charity groups and voluntary organisations and doing a lot of the unseen work behind the scenes that was helping people and communities all around the country to deal with the pandemic. And as we know, our industry is really regionally spread. So that means that people know about the likes of Pfizer, Novartis and Amgen because they're operating with massive plants in many cases in their own backyards. And that's one of the great things about the industry, that we are here in the crisis for the country and for the world. And because of the scaling nature of the industry, even during a pandemic, when the recovery happens in the economy, we're going to be there as well to help that along the way. So reputational challenges, though, are really on the horizon, and they've been outed, as I said earlier on, in terms of the supply issue in particular in the last number of weeks. And the pandemic landscape is constantly shifting. So whatever we might think about a reputation score with polling companies and so on, really, like, that's changing all the time. It's in flux, and we have to be able to respond to that quickly, not be complacent about the good job that we're doing, and be really agile in terms of responding to demands across the business as pharma, but also then across the business reputationally, and that's part of the job that we do. So public expectations are really high. I think we'd all agree with that. The vaccine breakthroughs have happened in record time, and people, I think, expect that the supply of them will actually happen in record time too, and that vaccines will work for all age groups. And of course, we know that's not always the case. And if you look there at the right-hand side, that graph is from today's FT. So it's taken a year for us to reach 100 million confirmed COVID cases in the world, and it's taken 6 weeks to administer 100 million doses of vaccines. And I think that really illustrates in stark form, the scale of the achievement of the industry in bringing through vaccines, safe and effective vaccines that have been approved by the EMA, approved by the HPRA here, the FDA in the States, and so on. And this really means that we have a chance of coming out of the pandemic. But the complexity of medicines and vaccine manufacturing is not fully appreciated by the public. And very often, vaccines, medicines are made in different plants. Sometimes they're made in different countries. There are parts of a medicine that are made in one place and another part in another place, and they have to be brought together for a finished product. So this is really, really complex stuff. And so the more vaccines that we get on stream, the less it will matter that if the yield comes down on one plant, it can be then sort of offset by an increase in another. And that really is where we're trying to get to, is to have enough supply in the system so that any outages are minimized. But there will be fluctuations in supply anyway. That's part of the nature of manufacturing in medicines, and we have to be able to deal with that and explain it to the public as well, so that they don't get frustrated by supply issues, and that they don't hopefully blame the industry either, because it's not always our fault. There are other stakeholders involved here as well, particularly the European Commission, as we've seen. So speed has happened, but not at the expense of safety. We really have to get that message out clearly to the public, because we know there is hesitancy out there on vaccines, but we can't afford to have people not taking the vaccine when they're able to get it, because if we do that, then we're going to reduce the mass inoculation which we need to get herd immunity, and we'll be slower coming out of this pandemic as a result. The European Commission has been criticised for building a European health union and for mishandling the procurement process. I think we have been, very cautious about blaming anybody for any missteps along the way, but we do not want to have the export restrictions in place. That would be a bad thing for the supply of medicines across the world and in Europe. We have said very clearly to the Commission and so have our colleagues in FPA that really we have to make sure that we facilitate the unfettered supply and distribution of vaccines and medicines around the world, and then imposing restrictions at this time would not be a good idea. So there will be hurdles along the way. Access is going to be an issue, obviously, particularly for those in poorer and developing countries, although COVAX is an enabler for that project to be helped along the way. There will be expectation from the public that we don't make any money out of this. I think that's true in some cases, in other cases it's not. But I think there is an expectation, rightly, and in the industry as well, that whatever profits are made from this expedition, that they will be small. The idea here is to try to fill a absolutely massive public demand and need for a vaccines, so that we can get back to some normality, or at least a version of it, very quickly. Public expectations also, I think, are around vaccines as the only exit strategy from the pandemic. That probably isn't true, because we're going to have to continue for a long time, I think, with the suppression of the virus through behaviours. And those two things, both suppression and vaccination, will have to run in parallel as we emerge from this over the coming months. Our own research, and Tarek will talk about this in a minute, shows that vaccine hesitancy is waning, but it will ebb and flow. We need to build confidence in immunisation in general, and in partnership with the health authorities, and we're doing that. And very soon we'll be launching our own vaccines confidence campaign, particularly in digital terms. And we are part of a wider piece of work with the Department of Health and health authorities, looking at how we can build vaccination confidence among the public, and that's a really, really important thing for us to do. Vaccines nationalism is always going to be around, I think, particularly in the UK, as we have seen. That's a big feature of their response, and it feeds into emotional sentiment. And you'll have seen the headlines recently in the papers. I mean, The Sun had a really great headline a few days ago: Brexit won and Brussels nil. That just shows the extent to which this issue is quite divisive when it comes to the vaccine rollout. So although it's a very good win for Boris Johnson, it's probably not a good thing for us in Europe to have this kind of messaging out there from the UK. So behind all of the vaccine stuff and the COVID stuff, our wider story continues, and we're working very hard to build a reputation of the industry as an important force for social and economic and healthcare improvement in the country. And that's what Innovate for Life, our campaign, which I hope you've seen, is really all about. It aggregates the industry story across what we call patients, places, and pioneers. So in other words, how can we basically make real to the public, to politicians, to stakeholders, what it is that happens in those massive manufacturing plants all around the country. What happens there really has massive implications for society, because it's not just the jobs that are created and the investments that they generate, it's actually that they work to make people's lives a little bit better, those who have illness, and often very serious illness. They have added prospects of living longer, and their quality of life is going to be improved. And the people who make that happen primarily are the people who work in our companies, and that's why scientists and communities and healthcare, all of this stuff is kind of in the Innovate for Life campaign, and it's about relevance and it's about relatability. So trying to kind of extract the myth from innovation in medicines and make it real to people along the way. So I'm going to play a couple of short films from our latest edition of the campaign. The first is going to deal with some cancer work that's going on with a doctor called Professor Owen Smith and his patient, who is now a doctor herself, Karen O'Neill. And they talk about the prospects for immunotherapy in tackling some rare forms of cancer. And the second short film is from Novartis, and that shows how gene therapy has joined the battle in the fight against sight loss. These are quite short films, so please do have a look. They're about 2 to 3 minutes in their entirety.
Sometimes a doctor fights so hard for their patient that in turn, it inspires the patient to become a doctor.
I'm a pediatric hematologist. I look after children with cancer.
My name is Karen O'Neill, and 12 years ago I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, and Professor Smith was my primary consultant.
On the ward rounds, I would ask her what did she want to be when she grew up, and she said she wanted to be a doctor, but more specifically, she said, I want your job.
I'm working as a paediatric doctor, and it's incredibly special and humbling to be able to be on the other side and treat children who are going on the same journey that I know all too well about.
We can manipulate a patient's own immune cells to turn itself back on the cancer. Some of the toxicities that we see in patients long-term after cancer treatment, we can offset those by using a less aggressive form of treatment in the form of immunotherapy.
And so the fight against cancer continues, one innovation, one personal story at a time. Innovation in medicines is helping people all over the world to live longer, healthier, more productive lives.
Ophthalmology is just a great discipline, and there's a lot of growth in ophthalmology, a lot of innovation. We will always keep finding new things. There's so much work out there, and there's so many conundrums to try and fix around sight loss and eye disease.
In my role in fighting blindness, our mission is very much centred around cure and improving the lives of the 250,000 people who are living in Ireland with sight loss.
Novartis in Dublin is helping to lead the battle against vision impairment. Pioneering work in cell and gene therapy has made Ireland an emerging research hub for the treatment of debilitating eye conditions, making a visible difference in the lives of patients.
There's a couple of examples of films that we've produced in the last few months. There are longer versions of that, of those films available on our social media channels, so please do check them out. But just to give you a sense of the reach of these, so we got some figures back this week, and they showed that in the 3 months, so November, December and January, generated 2.7 million impressions on those films, 1.3 million views and 11,000 engagements. So this is, this shows that this stuff is very powerful. And it wasn't just those 2 films, it was another one as well by AbbVie, which is around their operation in Sligo, and then also by Astellas, their operation in Killorglin. So we put 4 together in total, 4 stories, but then there were different versions of the same film that were going around on social. Some were short promotional versions, and some were longer. So I think this really shows that this stuff is very powerful, and people do like it, and they do engage with it, and as well as meeting their own targets for distribution and for reach. This year in this iteration of the campaign, we also improved on the 2019 edition of the campaign. So impressions are up 147%, video views are up 195%, and engagements are up 153%. So the more of the stuff that we do, and the deeper that we go into the stories, I think the more that we're going to get this story out to the public. And so the industry in Ireland has a lot of appetite for doing this kind of storytelling, because they see that it creates a lot of awareness of the value that's generated by companies in regions all around the world, economically, socially, and in healthcare terms. And this is a very neat way to tell that story. What was great about this edition was that IDA Ireland partnered with us on the launch of the latest new content. So that was really great to have. And then in the process of distributing around the social media world on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter particularly, we were able to secure great endorsements from industry, from patient advocacy, state agencies, from politicians, from business groups, sports organizations, and regionally, the media coverage is very good because people like that kind of storytelling in their own backyards. So I'm going to stop there in terms of my presentation, and I'm going to I'm going to actually turn to our fantastic panel of experts. And we have some great people with us today. So we have Mark Garrett, who is Managing Director at Teneo, the CEO advisory company. We have Doreen Markwell, who's the Commercial Director and Co-founder of Viewpoint Media. And we have Tara Glaher, who is Director at Ipsos BI. So I'm going to start, Mark, with you, if that's okay. So your vantage point is right into the heart of corporate Ireland and also the political world as well. What are you seeing in terms of the importance that corporate leaders and political leaders are attaching to representation in their own organisations as things stand today?
Yeah, well, look, Brian, thanks for having us on. And look, I suppose we can't really separate this conversation, I suppose, from the tragic events of the last 12 months that have seen COVID wreak all its damage on people's health and lives and the economy in general. But I think the starting point for me really is just to say I do think that the last 12 months provides a better platform for the pharma sector in Ireland and globally on which to build a long-lasting reputation long after COVID hopefully is no longer with us. I suppose the biggest contrast in my mind is with perhaps the banks, where I think you could go back to the financial crisis 12 and more years ago, where effectively the banks were part of the problem, where pharma ultimately is part of the solution in this case. And I think ultimately, if you look at as you say, some core stakeholders in terms of whether it be the public or in the policy sector, there's no doubt that there is a need to build a reputation for the organisation for pharma. I think you pointed out some of the international research which shows an uptick, but in many cases that comes from a low base where there's a lot of, I think, a lot of distrust. There has been over the last number of years. A lot of that is based on the stories coming out in regard to pricing and access and all of those issues. And I think they definitely need to be challenged. And I think you talk about the different, I suppose, trends we're seeing more, around reputation. And I think there's a lot of research which backs up what we all know instinctively, that there is a significant advantage to having a good reputation. And the reverse is also true. Big decisions by customers, certainly employees, in terms of working with organizations with better reputations, for investors and for regulators. All of those decisions are influenced by reputation. So reputation is an asset, and I think ultimately maybe one of the challenges for the industry is going to be, this valuable asset. How much are you willing to invest? And it's not just money, but it's time, energy, senior executive headspace in regard to investing in reputation. Huge investments in the R&D of your industry, even plant and equipment, and quite rightly in the people who work within the industry. But the real challenge, I suppose, is are you willing collectively and individually to invest behind that reputation? And I think broader reputation trends we're seeing is, there's no doubt it's a huge competitive environment. It's, out there at the moment, people through the various communication channels that they very much use, they're not just waiting for what the pharma industry has to say. There's a vacuum. If there's a vacuum out there, it will be filled by others. And in your absence, there's no doubt others will tell your story on your behalf. So they're not going to wait for you to tell the positives. They're going to perhaps have the criticisms ready to hand. So it's very important that you're out there telling your story yourself. And the other thing I think very strongly is that, the days of control are gone. The idea that the command and control model of communications is no longer the case. Everyone has a voice and they're willing to use it. And communications is very fragmented. Perhaps the best example we've seen in recent years is there's no doubt that in US politics, the president of the United States, most of the messaging would come from a person standing at a podium in the White House, talking to the journalists in the room who would then relay the story. In the front row would probably be the New York Times, the Washington Post. And we've seen quite clearly in the last 4 years that, a single tweet from Donald Trump will dominate the news agenda or change the news agenda overnight. And I think that's going to be an ongoing issue. So you've got to be out there constantly involving yourself in all the channels that you're talking about in terms of those videos and many others as well. And I think, look, there's changing role and expectations of companies in society. I think there's no doubt that people feel they want the companies they work for or they transact with to make a real impact. And if they don't understand that you are, well, then they will presume that you're not. So there has to be a need for and a role from the top, from CEOs, but right through the organization to understand that people want to make that commitment to organizations that they trust, and that building that trust is not just about having a say about the pharma sector. It's about having a say on the broader community that we all operate within. And I think that is a changing role of business in society. We're seeing that right from the top. We're seeing huge investors from BlackRock, who are the largest single investor in the world, basically pushing the companies that they invest in to ensure that we're not talking about purely maximizing shareholder value, but benefiting all stakeholders within that the organization touches. And I think that's going to be a very important part of that. So being part of that solution rather than part of the problem, whether it is clearly disease management or whether it is climate change and all of the other issues like inequality that are happening, diversity and inclusion, all of these issues, all the companies need to have a voice in these areas. And I think that is growing, and I think it's a key aspect of what we're looking at. But I suppose ultimately my starting point and my end point here is there is an opportunity, but it is simply that. It is only an opportunity. And I think it's about how does the sector grasp that opportunity in the years ahead, post-COVID and beyond, to ensure that that reputation lasts in the longer term and we don't return to, you showed a Gallup poll there earlier, Bernard, but the Gallup poll in 2019 showed of 25 industry sectors in the US, pharma was 25th out of 25 in terms of reputation. So the base is low at the start of COVID. There is an opportunity, but that opportunity will disappear unless it's grabbed. And I think there's got to be collective action by the sector. That's not just in Ireland, but Ireland is obviously important for all of us, but more broadly for the sector as well. And rows that we've seen in recent days and weeks don't help. But it also shows that I think the vulnerability of the political and policymaking system isn't always aware, as you say, of the details of the industry, but the industry has a role in educating the policymakers as well. And I think that's going to be a core part of reputation building over the next number of years. I'll leave it there. I'm sure there might be questions, and it's sometimes better to get into the questions and understand what people are interested in knowing, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. Tariq, Mark mentioned the devastating impact of the pandemic on people's lives, and that's really caused a lot of hardship, both in terms of the mortality rate, but also then how it's affected and disrupted their patterns of living. Now, you do a lot of research, both for our own industry, and you talk to a lot of doctors, a lot of consultants, and so you might have an insight into the effects that the pandemic is having on the healthcare system, on people's behaviours and on people's personal lives. What have you seen in your conversations with doctors, and what are you seeing in your polling for around sentiment for the industry so far?
Yeah, and thank you for having me on also. I think from the doctor's point of view, I mean, there has been a digital transformation across the healthcare sector. I think there's no doubt about that. And you know, really, if you think back to, you know, overnight March 2020, doctors were forced to adopt all of these digital channels, not only to talk to their patients, but obviously to interact with the pharmaceutical industry as well. What our pharmaceutical clients have been telling us is this is accelerating the change that we knew we needed to make anyway. So it's not that things weren't already happening. They were, but they were happening quite slowly. And I think what's happened now is COVID has been a massive trigger in terms of pushing that forward. There's always been a strong preference traditionally for face-to-face and traditional communications among healthcare professionals, but digital channels are on the increase. Comfort levels among healthcare professionals with those digital channels are also on the increase. And, you know, that is a challenge for industry as well, because how do you humanize those digital interactions? It's not easy. And, you know, we're finding it ourselves, to be honest, in the research business as well. I mean, our business is talking to people as well. And all the traditional face-to-face interviews that I would have done with doctors are now being done remotely as well. And, you know, it is clearly the dynamic is quite different, and how industry kind of adapts to that is very challenging. On the public side of things, I suppose what I would say, and I'd absolutely agree with everything Mark said in terms of perception of industry. I think from any time I've spoken to the public about this, their perception of the pharmaceutical industry is relatively limited. I think more people are positive than negative on balance, but a lot of people are in that neutral space where they simply don't know. For example, a lot of people don't know the name of the medicine that they're on, never mind the company behind it, never mind the industry behind that company. So, yes, of course, people are aware when you tease it out with them around, the great work that the industry does in terms of curing illness, keeping us well, doing a lot of good, and obviously making a huge economic and contribution and employment contribution to the country as well. But I think when you delve a little bit deeper, they don't really understand that much beyond that. And you do get cynical views as well around being profit driven and, well, is it in industry's benefit not to find a cure for X, Y, Z because they can keep us all on medicines? You do hear that from a minority of people. There's no doubt about that. And they don't know the challenges that industry faces as well in terms of pricing and in terms of access relative to other markets and so on. So, I think Mark made the point really well. I can't really add to that in terms of what they're saying, that opportunity is there. And perhaps COVID is that opportunity. I can talk a little bit about the vaccine data that we've done for IFA as well. We've been looking at this for a while in partnership with IFA. And if we go back to June last year, so a few months into the pandemic, we did a baseline study. One of the questions we asked the public was, when do you believe a vaccine will be found? Only 11% said they thought it would be found before the end of the year. So everybody else, the vast majority of people felt it would be at least into 2021. In fact, 1 in 4 people thought it would be 2022 or later. So we're already ahead of the curve there, in one respect. In terms of take up, our latest data, you may have seen it last week. Some of you, again, the survey we do for in conjunction with IFA, 75% of people said that they will personally take the vaccine. 18% were unsure and 7% said no. Now, that's a big jump. That's up 20 points since October, for example. So the trend is positive, and Bernard mentioned that at the beginning, and we would agree with that. You can speculate as to why people will or won't take the vaccine. Certainly, I mean, we cover this in all of the work that we do, not just healthcare, across industry. It comes up all the time. I think the reason why people will take a vaccine, it comes down to protection. You want to protect yourself, you want to protect your family, and you want to protect people generally. I think people feeling it's their civic duty. I think there is that kind of moral obligation, and people just feel this is the right thing to do. And I think also freedom. People want to be able to move, to travel, and really put the pandemic behind us. So there's lots of logical reasons why people will take the vaccine. Why are people hesitant? And I think, it's not all about conspiracy theories. Far from it. I think there's a lot of reasonable, thoughtful people out there who are hesitant because they don't know what they need to know to make the right decision around a vaccine. So it's an honest, logical reaction to an information and experience deficit is what we're seeing in terms of some of that hesitancy. They need more information. They're probably going to ask their doctor as well in a lot of cases. We know from our veracity index that we conduct every year, 95% of the public trust their doctor to tell the truth. So there is your key source in one way in terms of being an advocate for the vaccine. There is, of course, a minority of people, that we encounter, that we speak to about this kind of stuff, who have genuine reluctance and are concerned about, the speed with which the vaccines have come on stream, or obviously concerns over side effects, or don't believe in COVID even to begin with. So we do, of course, hear minority views like that as well. But this is going to be the largest, fastest, most challenging vaccination program in the history. That we've seen, and at the moment there's a mismatch between supply and demand, and that's obviously going to be corrected over time. But the hesitancy I think that we're seeing is transitioning into, I guess, a demand for immediacy. That's going to be the next step, and we're seeing that not only in Ireland, but in speaking to some of my counterparts in other parts of Ipsos around the globe. The early success of the vaccines is actually building confidence now. We're seeing that in Ireland. We're seeing it in UK data, France, Germany, Italy. There are other countries where the potential take-up is still very low. I know Japan, South Africa, Russia, France is increasing, but it is low at the moment as well. So there's an emergent challenge here too, and I might finish here just by saying, the challenge won't just be the take-up of the vaccine, but also convincing large segments of the public that they need to patiently wait for their turn. And that is going to take a little bit of time as well. And I think most of us are willing to accept that the most essential and vulnerable people in society need to get the vaccine first. How long that patience will last, we don't honestly know. We always look at things from a local perspective. We hear about lack of access to the vaccine in developing countries, but really that kind of falls on deaf ears. It's about what we care about what happens here in Ireland, and I think, you know, the public are relatively patient at the moment, but that's going to be a challenge to maintain that.
Great, Tarek. Thank you very much. And please, I remind the people who are on the call that if you'd like to ask any questions, please do use the chat function. Doreen, I'll come to you next from Ruepoint Media, a company that gets its name from a lighthouse on Rathlin Island in County Antrim. And I suppose you have a unique perspective on the volume, the type of media coverage, the characteristics, the fragmentation of the landscape in media these days, and social media as well. What have you seen in your analysis that led you to think that maybe this time it's different, that COVID media coverage is very unlike pre-COVID media coverage?
Thanks, Bernard. That's a really good question. I guess the thing in terms of what we do at Ruepoint Media is every single day we throw out our net. And there's an awful lot of sea analogies going on here at the moment, but we throw our net over the Irish media landscape, and we capture the conversation around print, broadcast, online and social media. And what we saw with COVID was really nothing like what we'd seen before. And I guess to put it in context, at this time of year, we would do a lot of annual reviews with our clients, and we would be talking about, this time last year, we've been talking about Brexit and what a dominant topic Brexit was in 2019 in the Irish media conversation. And it had generated 150,000 media items in 2019. Roll on March 2020 and COVID hit. And last year in 2020, COVID generated 1.1 million media items. So it was like nothing that we had ever seen before. And the impact to the media conversation was almost instant. So overnight, there became one singular topic in media conversation, and that topic was COVID-19. We saw that, again, literally overnight, 30 publications ceased publishing. And you know, a lot of these were kind of local publications, and we thought, goodness gracious, what is happening to this media conversation? And the whole media conversation actually contracted by about a third. So this created a huge dominance of the topic and a whole host of challenges outside of what we were all going through in our personal lives for communicators, because suddenly it was tumbleweed stuff. There was no topic other than COVID. And for some organizations like health and government, the big finance companies, the insurers, some of the retailers, you know, their level of coverage increased. Sometimes that was positive coverage, sometimes not so much. And really organizations needed to sort of adapt and try and look at, well, how do we become part of this conversation? This isn't in our media plans for 2020, and neither was becoming Mommy Moon Tour for me, but you know, them's the breaks, I guess. So it was like that for all of us. It was about adaptation. So organizations looked at what could they share in relation to COVID? What research did they have? What data did they have on their customers or habits or what charities and their interest groups? And that's what organizations used to gain positive exposure and media cut through during that period. And really going into H2, things started to open up a little bit as the first lockdown settled. But really it took to the end of Q4 in 2020 for things to what we would call sort of normalize. And we've seen that change again with this third lockdown, where that conversation again is becoming very, very COVID focused and the spotlight really very much being on the vaccine side of things and on the pharma industry. And what's interesting is, with that COVID conversation and its dominance within 2020, there were definitely, you know, winners and losers. In terms of level of coverage, definitely the pharma industry in 2020 saw a massive increase. The piece of work that we did for Bernard and the team, we saw that their media coverage doubled year on year. For organizations like AstraZeneca and Pfizer, massive increases. What we also saw, and Bernard touched on it earlier, was that 95% of that coverage was positive. So where there was, you know, there may have been previously perceptions internally about, oh, there's this sense of big pharma and it's all about profit. Actually, the COVID fight and what the work that was being done on vaccines and trying to deliver the vaccines, it really boosted that media sentiment. Now, going into Q4, going into Q1 of this year, we're seeing, you know, the rollout and the difficulties and the question marks and I think what's really interesting here, and Bernard, you talked about those particular challenges, the fact that, you know, there's different medicines, elements of it being made and created and produced in different places, and this will have an impact on that workflow and on that supply. And I think one of the key things that I took from this, and everyone's talked about opportunities, is there is a real opportunity here in terms of the media. The media are there with open ears. And one of the biggest things that boosts an organization's reputation in terms of media sentiment is openness. I will understand why there is a delay if you explain it to me, if you share that information, and pushing those messages is really going to be massively vital short term where we're looking at the rollout of these vaccines. I think the other piece in terms of that opportunity is if we look at the cut through and the success that we saw achieved in 2020, and actually it's the same kind of stuff that we often see delivering success, is storytelling. So those videos, those video clips that you saw, those short films, are an excellent way of showing real life people. We're just people, and it's great to have everybody involved from CEO down. But you know what? You can have somebody working in a factory in Sligo and talking about what they're delivering back as an organization and delivering those messages around social responsibility and what the pharmacy industry is delivering back to society. And that's a really, really powerful message. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity there for that voice. The other element, and I guess the final piece of the puzzle for me in terms of a massive opportunity that this industry has, is around thought leadership. And boy, you know, did we hear from Luke O'Neill and Samuel McConkley over the last over the last year? You know, they've become two of the most prolific speakers, and it really goes to show the importance and the impact that an expert voice can have. And really taking the time, and it's not easy. It's not easy to get people engaged with media. It's not easy for people to get trained and to be there at short notice when a comment needs to be made. But boy, does it pay dividend. And you are the absolute experts when it comes to vaccine. There's so much conversations around vaccine, but you're the experts. And you can as we talked about, there if there's a void, Mark, you said it'll be filled. Fill it with your voice. This is the opportunity that you have. And it's one that, as we talked about that media conversation opening up, and now it's zoning back in and it's very much focused on these vaccine conversations. And now is the time. And now is the opportunity. So I think there's a lot of challenges there, but as we said, there are answers and there's avenues to go about addressing that and turning those challenges into opportunities for the sector.
Thanks, Doreen. Very good. Mark, I'm going to come back to you actually, pick up there on Doreen's point about the sometimes reluctance of senior corporate leaders in our industry to attack the media. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but to put themselves out there in front of a bank of television cameras and become more mobile across social media platforms. You advise an awful lot of pharmaceutical companies very well. What would your advice be? Or first of all, do you think that's the case? Is there a kind of a little bit of a media shyness about the industry? And if it is the case, from your experience, how might one go about liberating the industry in the world of a fragmented media?
Yeah, look, I think there is, in all regulated sectors, there's a reluctance to, I suppose, engage heavily with the media, given the cautious nature of the sector itself. And I think that's understandable. But I think we've all touched on the same themes, which is the opportunity is there, but the question is telling the stories and who tells those stories. There's also good research which shows internationally, and here is the least trusted person in an organization is usually the CEO. And that's no disrespect to any of the personalities, but it's actually, the point is that this is the person who's paid to say that, and they would say that anyway, type of approach. Whereas the most trusted are the experts within the organization, whether, at different levels, the graduate recruiter who's coming in out of college, who looking to change the world, why did they choose that company? So telling the personal stories of the people in the organization, the patients, all of the things that have been done here, I'd suggest that the biggest challenge is doing that at scale and at speed, and doing it constantly. As they say, that the timeframes have just become shorter and shorter, because you had these videos or any other social media posting or whatever it might be. People will want new content all the time to fill those channels and to fill that competitive space. So it doesn't have to be the senior leaders in the business. It can be chosen to tell the appropriate stories in the right way. And I think the opportunity we've all talked about here is not just about COVID, though COVID is the platform right now and the vaccines. The reality here is engaging in the longer term and investing in that. And I think there's a real opportunity, because there's lots of people who need, as we talked about, right from the policymakers who obviously fund a lot of the medicines here in Ireland and across the globe, right through to the patients and the healthcare professionals, all of whom are, I think, in key need of education in these areas. And I think it's about telling those stories and constantly doing it.
If I could just add there to Mark's point, in terms of trust in different professions, I mentioned the figure when I spoke earlier on, 95% of people trust their doctor. But if we look down through the different professions, it's a real mixed bag in there. So you've got, your television news reader, 77% of people trust them. Pollsters, so we don't exclude ourselves from this poll. 56% of people believe pollsters, so only about half the public. 54% of us believe the ordinary person in the street, so our nearest neighbor, if you like. But business leaders, to Mark's point, 43% of people tend to believe business leaders and believe them to tell the truth. So there's massive variability. We're not down as low as advertising executives. 17% was their result, but we're, there's a real mixed bag there. Healthcare professionals very high, business leaders certainly in the lower part of the league table.
And I think the thing is as well, is that with these messages, particularly at the moment, you're pushing an open door. The public are hungry for information. They're hungry for what happens next. Like this uncertainty, it drives a thirst for information. And I think that also creates the opportunity for putting that information forward and delivering that side of the story. And I think there's obviously the wider piece around the overall reputation, but I think short term as well, there's just that response to the current uncertainty. And you take the advantage, you take the advantage of the momentum that you have now, and then you can carry on using that to cover your other messages. So the great thing about having an excellent spokesperson or somebody who provides thought leadership is initially they can be a point of information for one particular issue or one particular source, but they then increase their followers, they then increase their presence in terms of a go-to for journalists, etc. And that means that they can then start generating other stories and generating and delivering other messages that you're looking to get through as well.
And can I just add one last point I was going to make, was just, I think we're seeing a really powerful trend of communications from the inside out. In other words, the employee base that the sector has, in Ireland, is probably the most powerful advocates. And the question I would ask is that ultimately, how much communication goes towards selling that message internally to ensure, you think about not only those thousands of employees, but all of their families and their networks and the social media channels that they have, never mind the casual conversations, hopefully when the pubs come back, that we'll have as well. That ultimately they're probably the most powerful asset of telling the story of the industry in this country. And again, we've talked about it earlier, that's very regionally diverse as well and very powerfully economically in those areas. So there's lots of good stories to tell, but ultimately investment internally to tell those stories, because that really will be very powerful. And they're probably the people who will most defend the sector spontaneously, if they feel, I suppose, encouraged to do so, but also if they feel empowered with the understanding of key questions that might come up. So looking internally can be just as powerful as looking externally.
And I think one of the things industry has done very well is push the focus out towards the public and the patient point of view. I mean, certainly, the research that I've done over the years, 5-10 years ago, we didn't see that many research briefs looking to speak to patients or the public. It was mostly speaking to prescribers. There's been a huge cultural shift in recent years, and everything has become more patient-centric, and there's a huge interest among industry to understand the end user, to understand these patients, their lives, the journey that they go on with a particular condition, right down to pharmaceutical employees actually attending focus groups, viewing focus groups, accompanying me to interviews. So really trying to get an understanding about, it's not just about the medicine and the prescriber, but ultimately about understanding the public and the end user. So be they a patient with a condition, or be it the broader public and their understanding of a particular therapy area. I think credit where credit's due. Industry has come a hell of a long way in the last few years, certainly reflected in the proportion of that work that we are now doing, for example, that, certainly a decade ago, we were doing very little of.
So what you're saying, Tarek, is that pollsters are doing quite well because there's more of a communications and public sort of swing towards doing that kind of work, and therefore it needs to be based on some kind of insight, and that then generates a little bit more work for the polling industry. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I suppose I'd like to think we're always trying to fill information gaps, I suppose, ultimately, and whether it's understanding, behaviors or perceptions in terms of the public or healthcare professionals, absolutely. Like that appetite, I mean, to be frank, has remained, which is very encouraging. But that appetite has remained as well because of the innovation that's continual within the industry. So, the more new treatments and that are coming on stream, the more that information gap is there and needs to be filled. So it's really as a result of industry's progress as much as anything else.
And Mark, you've worked in government. Why is it that some political leaders are more predisposed to turning up at jobs announcements for Microsoft and Netflix and Facebook, and maybe are less inclined to be involved with the pharmaceutical industry? What's the gap that we need to fill in terms of perception between what it is that we do and what it is that politicians actually think?
Well, I don't think it's as black and white as that, that it's all one direction or the other. I think certainly from my experience, it depends on a number of factors. I think in recent years, I think the tech sector has lost some of its luster. I think the social media issues that we're all grappling with and we've seen politically have taken a little bit of a shine off that sector. And I think we can see, big tech is now a phrase as commonly used as big pharma or various other big industries as a negative. So I wouldn't say it is as straightforward as that. I do think that, to be honest, certainly I think there's still quite an appetite in the political world to understand the sector, to be involved in those jobs announcements, especially when they're outside Dublin. And I think there's also, an appetite for understanding what is actually happening in those facilities. Certainly from my experience, it's difficult enough for politicians to get in and understand those. There actually is more of an appetite, I would suggest, on the policy side to get in. I certainly, from my experience of when working in government, but also advising pharma companies, is that there's a reluctance to let people in, and there's some very good reasons for that. But I would suggest they don't have to get in and see all the clean rooms, but politicians really do like to see and be on the ground and see what's happening, talk to people in the canteen and so on. And when that, again, once that's possible, and I think there's a real opportunity for the pharma industry in general to engage at that level. So there's no doubt that as well, though, that the broad reputation of the sector has had some influence. And I think that, before COVID, most of the coverage that penetrated into policymakers was around, pricing. And it was around issues around access, certainly, but profits, pricing, compensation packages for global CEOs, and all of those issues. They're not immune to that media coverage, I'm sure, as Dorian will say. They see that more often than most do. They consume an awful lot of it. So they are shaped by that. They're not completely beholden to it, as you can see in terms of the interaction, but it is part of the interaction. So certainly one of the pieces of advice I would have is engage more, engage directly, invite them in. They're usually delighted. Certainly if you're in Cork, there's a wealth politicians right now of significant influence, but there are many other parts
and
of the country.
vocal.
Keep it local, absolutely. There is interest in that, or whether it's their industry sector. In fairness as well, if they're covered, the minister covers a particular area, but don't ignore that those who are up and coming as well. I think these are networks that can all be tapped into, and I think to build really good relationships. I think that most politicians in most constituencies are very keen to understand more and be positively engaged. And I think Ireland in general has a very positive attitude, unsurprisingly, to foreign direct investment. Most of the companies we're talking about are foreign owned. But I think the reality is that is a very big positive for Ireland. People understand the value of it. And I think there's absolute political consensus, for example, on issues such as support for the IDA, the corporate tax rate, various other, making Ireland an investment-friendly location. That doesn't mean there aren't subtle differences between the parties, but I think there's a consensus on those issues, unlike in most other countries. And I think that's a big positive for the industry and needs to be encouraged. It won't happen automatically. We talked about it earlier about the competitive environment. There are other sectors looking for the time of policymakers. Policymakers will look for the concept of how will Ireland grow in general over the next number of years. This is just one sector, so it's in the industry's interest to be engaged.
Okay, I think, Emer, we're almost at time, and we have about 2 minutes left. So are there any final remarks you'd like to make, any of our three panelists, that you'd like to just tell our audience?
I think there's been a lot of sort of negative around the pandemic. So I just wanted to make one point, which was I talked about those 30 publications that disappeared overnight, most of whom were regional publications. I'm delighted to report that all but 2 or 3 are now back publishing and back in business. So our local media, as ourselves and as our nation, is resilient. And I think that the pharma industry has a massive opportunity here to be, as we said, part of the solution, and for that to be something that really, in generations to come, you as people working within this industry can be very, very proud of.
I think I'll make one other point just there, back to our healthcare professionals. I think, reminding ourselves of the obviously the enormous challenges there, of course, they're undergoing, but the huge transition they've undergone from a technology point of view as well. One of them said to me the other day, we're more accessible but less focused, and it really stuck with me, because they have been bombarded with emails, webinar requests. They're grappling with the technology infrastructure that sometimes is subpar within some of the hospitals as well, and they're trying to get to grips with it all. I think their appetite for pharma support absolutely remains. Their appetite for education is very, very strong. It's about matching the right channels with the right content, really, and trying to find that right blend that's going to really cater for their needs. That's all I'd really say.
I suppose my last point would be back to the simple concept of you don't own your reputation, you can only help shape it and influence it. And without investing in engaging in that, and I think that's right through every organization and collectively together, because the reality is the industry can be influenced by 1 or 2 actions of 1 or 2 companies overall, and it's very important. We see that with the banks. People don't distinguish between the banks necessarily or the tech sector now. It's basically they're all tarred with the same brush. So it is collective action as well as the action of the individual companies as well. But ultimately, there's no command and control model anymore. Everybody has a say. It's very democratic in that sense. So if you don't engage, others will shape your reputation for you. So you've got to get out there and be very proactive about it.
And I can't let this go, Mark. I see behind you there's a really nice Mayo flag, and you're from, I think, Ballina. Is there going to be a visit by President Biden this year?
It's every year is Mayo's year. We just have to see how it works out. But there you go, Bernard. No vested interest on your part, clearly, on that issue.
None whatsoever. I'm from Knock, a different place altogether. Well, we hope to have a bit of a swing by if he does make it to Ballina,
That's
we have an airport after all.
You couldn't ignore herself.
No, I think that the most likely scenario is he's going to be over in Scotland for the climate action conference at the end of the year, and I think that's a potential. I'd imagine, as I know, talking to some of former colleagues who work in the embassy in Washington, say, wouldn't it be some irony if he came to Scotland and Ireland and not to England at the end of the year? So we shall wait and see how that plays out.
So on that note, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to thank Bernard for your great presentation. For Doreen, for Tarek, and Mark, I just want to add just one slight caution, just for everybody listening, whatever, in terms of promoting in social media in particular, just to be careful in terms of our code and mentioning products, etc. You wouldn't want to accidentally do anything outside of the code. So I suppose I just wanted to pop that in there just before I bid you all goodbye, and thank you for attending. Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.